Hello students. So in the last presentation, I have discussed the observation method, and in this presentation, that is chapter 2.4, in this part, I will cover experimental method, example of an experiment, concept of variable, experimental and control groups, control techniques of relevant variables, advantages and disadvantages of experimental method. Now, so far, you have already come to know that there are various methods in psychological inquiry. So, this is one of the another method. Now, let us see what is experimental method. Now, see, if I have to ask you a question that what do you mean by experimental method? So, here I'm assuming an answer from you people that someone might answer saying that experimental method is a kind of experiment where a person does experiment. Simple as that. Another one might tell me that experimental method is a method which is done in a laboratory setup. Isn't it? So this is my assumption that your answers will be somewhat like this. Alright. Now let us truly understand what an experimental method is. This is true. If your answers were lying in my assumptions, then somewhere you all know what an experimental method is. But let us try to understand it completely. So in order to understand, let us go first by the definition. So here is the definition of experimental method, where it has been mentioned that experiment is a research method whose defining features are manipulation of an independent variable or variables and control of extraneous variables that might influence the dependent variable. Now here, these variables, that is independent variable, dependent variable, then the extraneous variables, these are somewhat very important in an experimental method, and we will better understand it later in this chapter. In today's presentation itself, I will let you know about the variables, but for the time being, let us just focus on the definition of the experimental method and understand what an experimental method means. Okay, so experimental methods are uniquely powerful in allowing rigorous examination of causal effects without the uncertainties of other research methods. So it generally establishes cause-effect relationship between two sets of events or variables in a controlled setting. So whenever you hear of an experimental method, understand this, that it is being conducted in order to establish a cause-effect relationship between two sets of variables or two sets of events in a controlled setting. Okay, so in the experiment, cause is the event being changed or manipulated. Okay, and effect is the behavior that changes because of the manipulation. So it is a carefully regulated procedure in which changes are made in one factor and its effect is studied on another factor while keeping other related factors constant. I hope you're understanding it. Now let us see an example of an experiment so that it becomes clear for you people to understand what an experimental method is. So for example, does the color of a drink affect the taste? Cause and effect. Color of a drink, does it affect the taste of the drink? What do you think, students? Now students, the question in our experimental example was, does the color of a drink affect the taste? I don't know till now what is your answer. But to begin an experiment, a psychologist must identify his or her variables. And here you will know what a variable is. A variable is anything that can vary or change. In this case, both color and taste. So there are two primary types of variables, independent and dependent variables. Now see, you know that what an experimental method is by now. So experiment, it basically tries to establish a cause-effect relationship. And cause and effect, if you think deeply, of course our behavior, it is the effect of certain cause, isn't it? If we are behaving in a certain way, then there has to be a cause. Yes? So that is being proven by the experimental method, that whether there is any relationship that exists between a cause and an effect. For example, does the color of a drink affect the taste? So here, the color, it is the independent variable, which is the treatment. Okay, so the independent variable is the treatment variable that is manipulated by the psychologist, and it represents the causes of some outcome. On the other hand, the dependent variable, which is the taste, it represents the outcome that the psychologist is measuring. So this will be the data that is collected and analyzed. Now here the color, it can be manipulated by the psychologist, and the dependent variable, that is the outcome, the effect, is what will be studied. Now let us check your understanding between the independent variable and dependent variable. Now the question is, does money increase happiness? Now in this question, in this research question, you have to tell me which one is independent variable and which one is the dependent variable. You identified the independent and dependent variable in this scenario.